The late Queen Elizabeth II was incredibly popular. When she died in September 2022, the polling company YouGov had her ranked as Britain's best-loved public figure. With an approval rating of 75%, she was 6% more popular than steak and 3% more popular than spending time with one's partner. Her indoors, the trouble and strife, the old ball and chain. This general affection towards the Queen was also pretty consistent over time. Even during the 1990s, when opinion of the royal family as a whole was rocked by a series of scandals, the Queen herself remained widely adored. Liz's successor, King Charles, has not had such an easy ride of things. Ever since he cheated on and then divorced Princess Diana, always in our hearts, Lady Di, his relationship with the British public has been pretty strained. For a while, many Brits who were asked said that they didn't think Charles should become king at all, and that the crown should simply pass straight to his eldest son, Prince William. In recent months, this seems to have changed. Helped by an avalanche of sympathetic pieces in the media and a succession of state-funded ceremonies explicitly designed to legitimise the new monarch, Charles's popularity has skyrocketed. In early 2022, just 32% of Brits thought that he would do a good job in the role. By October, that figure had leapt to 63%. But it might seem strange that any of this matters in the first place. Isn't the whole point of being a queen or a king that you don't have to care what Brian and Jan from Swindon think? Well, these days, not so much. Over the past 2 centuries, the royal family's relationship with the press and the general public has become one of its greatest strengths, but also one of its biggest vulnerabilities. In fact, the very same monarch who opened the royal family up to public scrutiny in this way came very close to allowing it to bring down the entire institution for good. This video is part of a mini-series, which I've been releasing over recent weeks, which I'm calling Treason Fest 2023. With the coronation of Charles III just around the corner at time of release, an event which I am deeply excited about, I'm putting out a handful of slightly shorter than usual videos which foreground the stories of various Brits over the years who have tried to consign the British crown to history. Today, we're taking a look at how Queen Victoria founded the modern monarchy, and yet very nearly brought it all crashing down around her. Evening, Governor. Queen Victoria came to the throne just weeks after her 18th birthday, which, to give her a bit of credit, must have been a pretty tough gig. But her main challenge came in the form of this document. This is the Reform Act of 1832. It was signed into law by Victoria's predecessor, William IV, and was the first of several bills which, over the course of the next 100 years, would transform Britain from a corrupt feudal oligarchy to a, well, occasionally slightly less corrupt liberal democracy. By modern standards, the Reform Act was still wildly restrictive. Voting remained limited to men over the age of 21 who owned a certain amount of property, which amounted to only about 10% of the adult population. Nevertheless, it still presented the new queen with a problem. See, previous monarchs hadn't had to give all that much thought to whether or not they were popular among the general public. It was obviously nice to be liked. We all like to be liked, but the only people whose good books they really needed to stay in were the super wealthy men who sat in Parliament. In fact, Victoria's great-great-grandfather, George I, who was born in Germany, never even bothered to learn fluent English. Always the most topical gags in my videos. But the Reform Act had expanded the franchise to the middle class. And these new voters didn't have the same social and cultural ties to the monarchy as the aristocrats who had previously made up the electorate. In order to ensure they didn't use their ballots to curtail the power of the monarchy then, Victoria was going to need to completely rethink how the institution presented itself. She was supported in this by her husband, Prince Albert. Victoria first met Albert when they were both 17, which might be a surprise given that, in true royal style, they were first cousins. That being said, to the credit of themselves, and mostly those around them, there at least wasn't a problematic/illegal age gap, which cannot be said for more recent monarchs. Victoria and Albert's relationship was pretty tempestuous. On the one hand, Victoria's diaries record that they had a lot of sex. When her doctor suggested that they calm it a bit after the birth of their 9th child, she supposedly asked him for advice on what else they were meant to do in the evenings. On the other hand, they argued viciously and constantly. Nevertheless, from the outside, their relationship seemed pretty idyllic, to the point where it's still often held up by some, including those bloody court propagandists at Horrible Histories, as one of history's great love stories. Yeah, that's right, I continue to have my eye on you, children's BBC. And this external vision of domestic bliss was very much by design. See, Albert had come up with a plan for appealing to the newly enfranchised middle class. He would offer himself and his family up as proto-celebrities. Alongside her political function as head of state, the Queen would now also be the head of a cultural phenomenon known as the royal family. The royal family wasn't only intended to be something for the emerging middle class to gossip about or buy terrible merch relating to. I mean, it did also become that. I would guess that most Brits have at least one piece of horribly tacky royal merch somewhere in their house. I've been a staunch Republican since I was a teenager, and somehow all of these mugs have just accumulated in my loft. This one is for the coronation of Edward VIII, an event which got cancelled before it actually happened. Why do I have that? Douai Mon Detroit. But Albert's intention was to craft a perception of the royals as a kind of ideal model family, which the British middle class could aspire to recreate in their own lives. Previous monarchs had often been associated with debauchery. Victoria's uncle, George IV, had at least 9 mistresses, enough for them to get their own category page on Wikipedia. But from now on, the royal family would be a picture of middle-class morality. Victoria and Albert were incredibly well suited to this role. Victoria was, as we've discussed, incredibly horny. She apparently had a quote-unquote sex button installed next to her and Albert's bed, which could remotely lock the bedroom doors if they started getting down to it. As this Cosmopolitan article I found on the subject puts it, "Get it, girl. Cold shower, please. Yas, queen." I guess it's funny because she's an actual queen. Nevertheless, Victoria and Albert seem to have been fairly unique among British royals in having remained entirely faithful to one another. They were also incredibly fertile and had 9 children together over the course of just 18 years. In addition to projecting this image of the perfect family, Albert also courted favour with the middle class by getting involved with charity and other aspects of civil society. These days, supporters of the monarchy often talk up the royal family's charitable activities. At the time of her death, Queen Elizabeth II was the patron of more than 600 charities. Which, let's be honest, at that point means absolutely nothing. I'm sorry, the Seamen's Christian Friends Society. I'm sure you do fantastic work telling sailors about Jesus, but realistically, the Queen did not care about you one bit. Victoria and Albert weren't the first royals to engage in charitable work, but they were the first to do so in such an intentional, calculated way. The most significant achievement of Albert's involvement in civil society, however, was his spearheading of the Great Exhibition of 1851. The event was conceived as a celebration of the many technological and commercial advances that were emerging from the ongoing Industrial Revolution. Held in an enormous glass structure half a kilometre long, it showcased 100,000 exhibits, not only from Britain, but from across the world. My favourite of these exhibits is the Tempest Prognosticator, which was designed to predict the weather based on the anxiety levels of 12 leeches trapped in glass bottles. Forget the Liver King or whoever, building something like this? This is peak masculinity. 6 million people are said to have attended the Great Exhibition during the 6 months it was open. The equivalent of 1/3 of Britain's entire population at the time. Victoria and Albert's rebranding of the royal family as virtuous, charitable, civically minded role models for the rest of the country was evidently a massive success. There's a reason their descendants continue to do all this same stuff today. It seems to work. For a lot of people, a member of the royal family occasionally spending an afternoon volunteering at a homeless shelter does seem to be enough to justify them living lives of extreme luxury at the taxpayer's expense. Yet, as the 19th century wore on, this new emphasis on public approval very nearly backfired for Queen Victoria, and threatened to bring the entire institution of the monarchy down with her. But before we go any further, I hope it's apparent that making these videos involves a lot of research, which I absolutely love. But for aspiring creators, students, and others looking to create high-quality, factual work, I think that undertaking research can often be pretty foreboding. That's why I teamed up with my friends over at Nebula to create my brand new class, How to Research Like a PhD Student, which I'm super excited is now available to watch as part of Nebula classes. Across a series of 16 lessons, I'm pulling back the curtain on my research process. I share my strategies for finding good sources, for efficiently reading large amounts of material, and for taking and organising notes that will be useful for years to come. I'm really proud of what we've created with this class. It feels really comprehensive, and the team at Nebula have made it look absolutely beautiful. Which, let's face it, was a pretty tough task given what they were working with. How to Research Like a PhD Student is part of a huge catalogue of premium content which is exclusive to Nebula. This includes further classes from the likes of Legal and Foreign Man in a Foreign Land, as well as plenty of non-classes stuff too, including premium originals from Lindsay Ellis, Second Thought, and Maggie May Fish. In fact, I'm currently really enjoying Maggie's Nebula original series Unrated, which explores the history of sex and sexuality in cinema and the battle against censorship. A series of which I'm sure Queen Victoria would have very much approved. If you've yet to sign up to Nebula, then I'd be super grateful if you do so using my personal link go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. This will score you a full 40% off an annual subscription, meaning that you can watch all of that video goodness for just $2.50 a month. Signing up using my link and watching my videos over on Nebula also really helps to support me to continue to make more videos like this one and invest in making them even bigger and better. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. I cannot wait to hear what you think of my new Nebula class and how it is able to help you in your own research projects. But for now, let's get on with the show. In 1861, Prince Albert made the questionable decision to die, most probably of typhoid. And Victoria was, understandably, pretty upset about this. She fell into a deep depression, later writing that paroxysms of despair and yearning and longing, and of daily, nightly longing to die, never left me. Consumed by this grief, she began to dress in nothing but black and to turn down all public appearances. The general public were initially very understanding. Nevertheless, days quickly became weeks, which became months, which became years. And still, the Queen chose to stay hidden away in her palaces. In other circumstances, this might not have been such a problem. But Albert had conditioned Brits to expect their monarch to be on show, to be present at the opening of public buildings, and to support charity and the arts. Victoria's sudden absence then felt notable. At the same time, the fantasy Victoria and Albert had projected of the royal family as paragons of Christian virtue was also starting to unravel. This was mainly the fault of Victoria's eldest son, and heir to the throne, Albert Edward. Where his parents had been a picture of monogamous bliss, Albert Edward liked to share his love around a bit. Somehow, this video about Victorian England is the horniest video I have ever made. This led to several scandals, including one incident in which he was called to testify in the divorce proceedings of a member of parliament whose wife he'd almost definitely slept with. Finally, the royal family had become increasingly expensive to maintain. It might seem bad enough today when Prince William gets given £4 million in taxpayer cash to spruce up one of his 4 literal palaces. But now imagine if, rather than just having 2 children, the king had 9 of them. Frustrations ran particularly high in 1871, when Victoria convinced Parliament to fund a dowry worth over £2.8 million in today's money for her daughter Louise, along with an annual stipend of £2 million for her favourite son Arthur. On a purely financial basis, all of this began to look like pretty bad value for money. The monarchy was gobbling up public funds whilst offering very little other than embarrassment in return. One morning in 1864, a sign appeared, fixed to the railings of Buckingham Palace. It was a parody of a 19th century for sale sign, reading, "These commanding premises to be let or sold in consequence of the late occupant's declining business." We know it was a parody because when a real estate agent uses the phrase commanding premises, they usually just mean that you can't see the cooker from the bed. And this incident ended up being the prelude to a rising tide of Republican sentiment. Republican here meaning opposition to the monarchy, not Nancy Pelosi drinks human blood. One of the things that's particularly interesting about the Republican movement of the 1860s and 1870s is quite how grassroots it was. It did eventually attract figureheads such as the atheist campaigner Charles Bradlaugh and the radical MP Charles Dilke, because what this miniseries really needed was more guys named Charles. But high-profile men such as these were often wary of being seen as leaders of the campaign. There was a good reason for this. Criticising the monarchy in 19th century England was a genuinely dangerous business. Of course, even these days, if you rock up to a Coronation Day street party wearing a t-shirt with "Bring Back the Guillotine" on it, you're probably going to invite a few looks and maybe get kicked out of the neighbourhood group chat. But in the 19th century, arguing for the abolition of the monarchy was a serious criminal offence. There was a very real chance that you could end up sent to prison or on a convict ship headed for Australia. It's a testament to the level of resentment that many felt towards the crown then that Republican clubs began to spring up across the country. It's estimated that during Queen Victoria's absence, more than 140 such groups were set up across Great Britain. Some of these societies had just a few members, whilst others boasted thousands. These Republican clubs would host lectures, share reading materials, and organise demonstrations. They also developed a strong cultural identity. They celebrated the memories of previous Brits who had attempted to bring down the monarchy, including Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Paine. Which, you know, if you want to hear more about either of those, I've heard someone made really good videos about them. You should check them out. They also borrowed some ideas from their fellow Republicans in France, who at this point were on their 4th revolution and adopted their own flag. a tricolour of green, white and blue. By the early 1870s, Queen Victoria had been missing in action for more than a decade. And with each year that had passed, popular animosity towards the monarchy had grown further. By 1872, two national federations of Republican groups existed, the National Republican League and the National Republican Brotherhood. In fact, support was so strong that during a speaking tour in Spain, Charles Bradlaugh declared that he had little doubt that within 20 years or less, we shall have the Republic in England. Bradlaugh might have been a little optimistic in that prediction, but many of the Queen's allies were deeply worried. Her family begged her to make some public appearances to try and reignite support for the crown. Her son, Albert Edward, was perhaps most blunt, telling her, "We live in radical times, and the more people see the sovereign, the better." The problem for the Republicans was that despite the passing of a second Reform Act in 1867, voting was still restricted to just 15% of the adult population, most of them incredibly wealthy and thus much less interested in challenging the Queen's power. When the MP Charles Dilke proposed that Parliament launch an inquiry into the amount of taxpayer money that Victoria was guzzling away, the motion was defeated 276 to 2. Without the vote, and lacking the desire to embark on a full-on revolution, the Republican movement thus found itself with very little means of acting on its beliefs. In the longer term, the monarchy was saved by the same thing which had put it at risk in the first place: the old typhoid. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. I feel like that joke only really works if you know that typhoid mainly spreads through water, but now you do know that, so maybe you could skip back 15 seconds and watch that again, and maybe that would be funny. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. The similarities between Albert Edward's illness and that of his father 10 years previously sparked an avalanche of sympathetic press coverage and, by extension, public sympathy for the royal family. The whole ordeal suddenly made advocating for the overthrow of the monarchy seem kinda heartless. Just as Prince Albert had planned for all those years ago, interest in and concern for the royal family as human beings ended up saving the political institution of the monarchy that they were the faces of. Many British Republicans thus began to look for other causes to support, in particular the pursuit of voting rights for all adults. Or at least all adult men. While Victoria managed to survive this challenge, however, her reign had fundamentally changed the monarchy. Particularly since full adult suffrage was achieved in 1828, an increasing amount of the royal family's time has had to be dedicated to merely sustaining their popularity. Where previous monarchs fought to increase or defend their power, kings and queens since have been forced to fight for their very survival. It's hard to predict whether or not the new king's jump in popularity will endure. There's a well-observed phenomenon in polling wherein political leaders get a popularity boost during their party conventions as a result of the simple fact that they're on telly a lot more. And what is a coronation if not a political convention for inbred Germans? Charles's mum was incredibly skilled at managing her public image. Some of this came down to the things that she did. She was a constant presence, whether that was handing out awards to celebs, visiting cities across the UK, or welcoming foreign leaders to London. But as much of it was down to what she didn't do. Queen Elizabeth II didn't give a single unrestricted press interview in her entire life. She revealed almost nothing about her personal political views at all. This had the effect of allowing others to project their own views upon her. If you were an ardent Brexiteer, you could convince yourself that the Queen was an ardent Brexiteer too. If you wanted Britain to remain in Europe, you could convince yourself that she was also a secret Remainer. Charles, frankly, sucks at this stuff. His divorce from Princess Diana and close friendship with Jimmy Savile weren't exactly great starting points. But throughout his time as heir to the throne, he's also constantly sought to intervene in politics. Whether it's his support for fox hunting or his environmental campaigning, it's going to be much, much harder for him to be all things to all people as his mother was. And perhaps this might end up leaving the door open for Republican sentiment to emerge once more. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you found it enjoyable or interesting in some way. If you have, and you would like to consider supporting me to make more videos like this one, then you can do so either by checking out my brand new Nebula class over on Nebula at go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, or by joining some of these wonderful people that I'm about to shout out in being signed up to my Patreon, where you can get access to copies of the script to my videos with lots of footnotes and references, and access to director's commentaries to them, as well as weekly updates in terms of what I've been working on in a particular week and a look ahead at some of the stuff that I'll be releasing. But a big thank you as ever to those who are signed up to the top tier of that Patreon, which includes Richard, Alan Gann, Gary, Dickon Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Neil Zabildgaard, Sophia R, Sir